Imagine stepping off a dusty Kansas trail in the 1870s, tired, hungry, desperate for rest. You see a lantern glowing in the distance, an inn run by a friendly family. But what if I told you that the moment you stepped inside, your fate was already sealed? The year was 1871. The plains of Kansas stretched endlessly, silent except for the howling wind across the tall grass. Travelers came in waves, dreamers chasing land, merchants hauling goods, lonely wanderers with pockets of gold. And on a lonely stretch of Osage Trail, a family appeared. They called themselves the Benders. At first glance, they looked like the picture of hospitality. John Bender S.R., his heavy German accent thick as thunder, his wife stoic and strange, muttering prayers in a language few understood. Their children, Kate, young and beautiful, promising spiritual healing to anyone who crossed her path, and John Jr., awkward but always grinning. They built a one-room cabin that doubled as an inn, a small grocery for passing travelers, with a simple wooden curtain dividing the dining space from their sleeping quarters. The place smelled of stew and fresh bread. A weary traveler would sit down, thinking he had found a blessing on the lonely prairie. But behind that curtain, something unspeakable waited. The Benders had dug a trapdoor beneath the dining table. Victims would sit with their backs to the curtain, unsuspecting. While they ate, one of the Benders would creep up behind them with a hammer, a sudden blow to the skull. The sound of bone cracking mixed with the hiss of stew boiling over the fire. The bodies didn't vanish into thin air. They were dragged down through the trapdoor into a cellar. The air reeked of iron and rot, soaked with blood. And when night was darkest, the Benders carried those bodies into the orchard, burying them beneath apple trees. Sweet fruit hiding rotten secrets. And here's the terrifying part. No one noticed for years. Travelers kept vanishing along the trail, but the prairie was vast, unforgiving. People disappeared all the time. It wasn't until the disappearances became impossible to ignore that whispers began. Could the friendly family running the inn be hiding something? The Benders smiled, greeted new guests, and went right on killing. And the scariest part, every single person who walked through their door thought they were safe. Because soon, someone would go missing who was too important to ignore. And when that happened, the bloody orchard of the Benders would finally be exposed. What if the people vanishing on America's frontier weren't lost to storms, wolves, or outlaws, but to something far more sinister, a family hiding in plain sight? By 1872, the Osage Trail had become a highway of hope. Settlers, preachers, Civil War veterans, and traders all passed through. But slowly whispers began. Men rode into the prairie and never rode out. Families sent letters back east and replies never came. Horses were found wandering without their riders. Wagons abandoned, wheels broken, blood smeared faintly in the dirt. The prairie could be cruel, yes, but these vanishings weren't random. They formed a pattern, and if anyone had been brave enough to map it, they would have seen that all the disappearances led to one place, the Bender Inn. Local gossip painted Kate Bender as a healer, a young woman who claimed she could summon spirits, cure illnesses, and connect grieving families with their dead. Many men were lured not just by food and shelter, but by the chance to spend time with her. The Benders knew this, and they used it like bait. Neighbors started to notice. One man swore he had seen travelers enter the inn but never leave. Another claimed he saw freshly dug soil in the orchard at night, moonlight gleaming on the spade. And yet, every time someone questioned the family, they smiled. Kate laughed it off, promising her neighbors that wicked spirits were simply taking souls into the afterlife. But here, the chilling truth. The Benders' orchard wasn't feeding the land, it was swallowing it. Every missing person was another body beneath the apple trees, another secret buried under blossoms. The sweet smell of fruit in spring mixed with the stench of decay. Still, no one dared accuse them directly. Fear hung heavy over the community, not fear of the family, but of being wrong. After all, Who would believe that an innocent innkeeper's family was slaughtering travelers for money and fun? But one disappearance changed everything. A man named Dr. William York, a respected physician, vanished after traveling through the area. Unlike the other victims, York wasn't just another nameless wanderer. He was connected. His powerful brothers would not let his disappearance fade into silence. For the first time, the Benders had killed someone whose absence demanded answers. Because when Dr. York's brothers came searching, the curtain between the Benders, charm and their horror would finally start to tear. And once it ripped, the world would discover what had been happening inside that little cabin. Imagine sitting down for dinner, a warm stew, a friendly smile across the table. But what you don't know is that beneath your feet, a trapdoor waits, hungry for your blood. The Bender Inn was no ordinary cabin. It was a carefully staged theater of death. The table was positioned with precision, chairs lined so that a traveler would sit with his back to the faded cloth curtain. On the other side of that curtain, one of the Benders waited, hammer in hand. The murder was quick but never silent. As the victim lifted his spoon, a Bender would creep forward, raise the hammer high and bring it crashing down. The dull, wet sound of skull shattering was often the last noise a traveler ever heard. The stew boiled, the lantern flickered, and another life ended. The body slumped forward, blood dripping onto the floorboards, sometimes pooling against the traveler's untouched meal. Before the victim could scream, the Benders dragged him toward the trapdoor beneath the table. That cellar was no ordinary storage pit. It was a tomb. Neighbors later said that when they first opened it, the smell of rot was so overpowering it made grown men stagger back, choking. The earth was soaked red, the boards stained with gore that had seeped into the wood over months, maybe years. Kate Bender, always calm, always cold, would search the victim's body. Money, jewelry, watches, anything of value went into the family's stash. The victims weren't just killed for convenience. They were slaughtered for profit. But here's the bone-chilling detail. Some bodies weren't killed instantly. A few travelers were thrown into the cellar still alive, their groans muffled by dirt and floorboards. Imagine being trapped in the dark, broken, bleeding, hearing footsteps above you, hearing laughter, knowing you were buried beneath the same floor where strangers were now eating dinner. And when night came, the Benders carried the corpses out into the orchard. They dug shallow graves, planting bodies like seeds, covering them with the same soil that grew their apples. A graveyard hidden in plain sight. The sweet blossoms of spring were nourished by human blood. To the outside world, the Benders were innkeepers, farmers, a family making a living on the trail. But behind the curtain, under the table, beneath the earth, they were monsters. And yet, for months, maybe years, nobody caught them. Until one man's disappearance would finally rip the mask away and force the Benders into the light. What if the family you waved to at church, the people you trusted with food and shelter, were secretly killers hiding dozens of corpses beneath their feet? The most terrifying part about the Benders wasn't just the murders. It was how perfectly they played their roles. To neighbors, they were simply another immigrant family carving out a life on the Kansas prairie. They tilled the fields, sold groceries, and welcomed travelers with warm smiles. Kate Bender was their greatest weapon. Young, attractive, and claiming mystical powers, she drew people in. She hosted seances, telling grieving widows she could summon lost husbands, promising lonely men she could heal their hearts and their bodies. Men followed her into that unwillingly, thinking they were stepping into salvation. Instead, they were stepping into a trap. Her brother, John Jr., was socially awkward, often laughing at strange moments. Locals brushed it off, thinking he was just simple-minded. They didn't realize his laughter sometimes masked the sound of men dying just a few feet away. Even the elder Benders had their roles. John S.R., with his heavy German accent, played the part of a gruff but hard-working pioneer. His wife, often called a she-devil by locals, was cold and harsh, yet no one imagined she was knee-deep in murder. And when suspicion arose, because it always did, the Benders deflected with ease. If neighbors mentioned the missing travelers, Kate would claim the spirits had taken them. If others wondered about the freshly dug soil, John S.R. said he was just planting. But here, the chilling truth: people trusted them because they wanted to. On a frontier filled with fear and uncertainty, settlers wanted to believe in neighbors, in kindness, in community, and the Benders exploited that trust to the fullest. Even lawmen came through their inn: sheriffs, traders, respected citizens, and yet not one recognized the horror beneath the trapdoor. The Benders' greatest crime wasn't just killing, it was convincing everyone around them that they were incapable of it. One neighbor would later recall that the Benders often seemed too friendly, too eager. The family laughed at strange hours, closed their curtain during meals, and worked in the orchard at night. Looking back, all the signs were there. But at the time, people saw only what they wanted to see: a family just like theirs. And that's what makes their story so horrifying. Evil wasn't hiding in shadows, it was smiling across the dinner table. But innocence can't last forever, because soon a powerful family would come looking for a missing man, and when they did, the mask of the Benders would shatter. A respected doctor vanishes on the Kansas frontier, but unlike other travelers, his disappearance wouldn't be ignored, because this time, the wrong family had chosen the wrong victim. In the spring of 1873, Dr. William York set out along the Osage Trail. He was well-liked, well-respected, and most importantly, well-connected. When York failed to return home, concern spread like wildfire. This wasn't just another nameless wanderer lost to the plains. This was a man whose family had influence, power, and reach. Dr. York's two brothers began searching, and they weren't ordinary men. Colonel Ede York, a Civil War veteran with military discipline and fire in his eyes, vowed to uncover what happened. Meanwhile, Alexander York, a powerful Kansas senator, used his political clout to rally attention. Suddenly, the missing travelers weren't rumors anymore. They were a scandal, one that demanded answers. Colonel York rode the trail himself, interviewing locals, retracing his brother's steps. Again and again, the trail led him to the same place: the Bender Inn. York visited the Benders directly. He ate at their table. He looked into their eyes. He questioned them about his missing brother. And the family, cool as ever, denied everything. Kate even offered to use her spiritual gifts to help find him. Imagine the audacity: the sister of a murderer pretending to summon the very man she'd buried in her orchard. But York wasn't convinced. He began to notice things: the Benders' awkward answers, their nervous laughter, the way their eyes darted when he pressed too hard. And then came the chilling twist: other families joined the search. They began whispering their own suspicions. Neighbors admitted they'd seen travelers enter the inn but never leave. Rumors spread of strange smells wafting from the orchard. York wasn't alone anymore. The community was waking up. York gathered evidence: scraps of belongings, accounts of missing men last seen near the inn. Pressure mounted. The Benders smiled through it, but the cracks in their mask were widening. They could feel suspicion creeping closer. And then, fate turned against them. A storm of anger was building, fueled by the York family's determination and the whispers of neighbors. It was only a matter of time before someone dared to tear open the earth in that orchard. And when they did, they would find the orchard wasn't filled with roots and blossoms. It was filled with bodies. Imagine uncovering a graveyard in your neighbor's backyard, dozens of corpses staring back at you from shallow earth. And the killers, gone like ghosts in the wind. The search for Dr. William York didn't die with questions. It erupted into action. Suspicion grew too heavy, and finally, in May 1873, a posse of neighbors and lawmen descended on the Bender property. The inn stood silent, its door creaking in the prairie wind. The smell of damp earth clung to the air. Inside, the cabin was abandoned. Dust clung to the shelves, food sat uneaten, and the curtain that once hid the family's murders swayed gently in the breeze. But when the posse lifted the trapdoor beneath the dining table, the nightmare spilled out. The cellar was soaked in blood. Dark stains coated the boards, the earth beneath saturated with decay. The air was suffocating, heavy with the stench of death. One man reportedly staggered back, retching, unable to breathe. Another swore the ground itself seemed to whisper with the groans of the dying. And then came the orchard. Shovels struck the earth, and one by one the bodies emerged. Dr. York's corpse was among them, his skull caved in. Alongside him were men, women, even children, all slaughtered in the same brutal fashion. Some had throats slit, others crushed skulls. One grave held a small girl, likely buried alive. The prairie, once silent with suspicion, now screamed with horror. Neighbors who had eaten at the Benders' table realized they had dined above a pit of corpses. Every traveler who vanished, every whispered fear, was suddenly real. But the greatest shock of all, the Benders were gone. Beds lay stripped, possessions missing, horses taken. It was as if the family had melted into the prairie. Some claimed they fled west, others said north into outlaw country. Rumors whispered they were lynched in secret by vigilantes. The truth? No one knows. To this day, the Benders were never officially caught. Their vanishing became a legend, a phantom curse haunting Kansas. Parents warned children, behave or the bloody Benders will get you. Their names became myth, their orchard a place people crossed themselves when passing by. And yet the unanswered question still chills the bones. How could a family of killers simply disappear? Because while the graves of their victims were unearthed, the fate of the Benders themselves remains buried in mystery. And that is where this story turns from Kansas horror to the cursed bloodlines of history itself. Imagine this. You're standing in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter of 1846. The snow isn't just falling, it's crushing, swallowing the land in white walls nearly 20 feet high. And deep inside that frozen hell, the Donner family and nearly 90 other pioneers were trapped. Their dream, to reach California, the land of gold and promise. But what unfolded would make them one of America's most cursed families in history. At first it was hunger, then disease, and finally, something so dark most couldn't speak of it, cannibalism. The Donner Party started with hope. Families, children, wagons filled with dreams. But after taking a so-called shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff, they lost precious time. By October, the mountains became their prison. Each day, snow buried them deeper, blocking escape. The sights were brutal. Imagine the sound of frozen wood snapping as people tried to build fires with what little was left. Imagine the smell of decaying oxen, buried beneath ice. And imagine the silence of children crying themselves to sleep with nothing in their stomachs but leather straps boiled into soup. The Donners weren't the first to suggest eating the dead. But when desperation clawed at their sanity, families looked at the frozen bodies around them not as friends, but as survival. Some resisted, clinging to faith. Others gave in, whispering prayers as they tore flesh from bone. Survivors later recalled the eerie quiet as snowflakes fell over the camp, masking the horror beneath. And here's the cruelest part. The Donners weren't just victims of nature. Historians argue they were victims of lies. Lansford Hastings, who promoted the shortcut, had never even traveled it himself. The family was lured into a deadly trap by ambition and greed. What would you do if your family was starving before your eyes? Would you break the ultimate taboo to survive, or let fate bury you in ice? When rescuers finally arrived months later, the sight was unspeakable. Half of the group was dead. The Donners themselves were reduced to whispers in history, symbols of hunger, hope, and horror. But the legend of the Donner family isn't just about cannibalism. It's about how quickly civilization unravels when stripped of warmth and bread. It's about the thin line between faith and despair, humanity and madness. And here's the real sting. While California became the land of opportunity for thousands, the Donner's legacy was forever tied to a nightmare, a cursed name whispered in the American story of survival. Even today, locals say the Sierra winds carry whispers, shadows of the starving voices still trapped in the snow. But if the Donners were swallowed by snow, the Salem families were devoured by fire and paranoia. The year was 1692. Salem, Massachusetts, a town choked by fear, where the air itself felt heavy with suspicion. By day, the streets echoed with hymns of piety, but by night, whispers of the devil slithered through every crack in the wooden houses. And at the center of it all were the families of Salem, bound not by faith, but by the fire of paranoia. It began with strange fits, girls thrashing, screaming, claiming unseen hands were choking them. Doctors couldn't explain it, so the conclusion was simple, chilling, and final: witchcraft. The accused weren't outsiders. They were mothers, wives, daughters, the very pillars of Salem's own families. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Children accused their own parents. Husbands pointed fingers at their wives to save themselves. It wasn't witchcraft that destroyed Salem. It was fear itself. Picture the scene: cold wooden courtrooms filled with trembling villagers. The smell of sweat, smoke, and fear. Every word spoken was a dagger, every silence a death sentence. Families like the Putnams used the hysteria for personal gain, accusing rivals to steal land and wealth. Witchcraft trials weren't just about religion. They were about greed, power, and vengeance, hidden beneath a cloak of holiness. The executions weren't all burnings. Some were hanged. One was pressed under stones until his bones cracked, and countless others rotted in cold, filthy jails. The fire wasn't always literal. It was the fire of hysteria consuming every soul. What would you do if your own child stood in court, screaming your name as a witch? Would you confess a lie to live, or die with the truth? By the time the madness ended, 20 people were executed and over 200 accused. Entire families destroyed, reputations burned to ash, bloodlines forever marked by the curse of Salem. The darkest irony: historians believe many of the fits and visions were caused by poisoned rye bread, hallucinations born from fungus, not demons. Innocent families murdered because of mold. Wait, what? Even today, Salem carries the scar. Tourists flock to see the witch trial memorials, yet locals whisper that the ground still feels cursed, that the souls of the accused have never truly left. Some families who survived wore the shame like a brand for generations. Even centuries later, descendants of the accused fought to clear their ancestors' names. Imagine carrying a curse for 300 years. And here's the final sting: Salem wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning of what happens when fear blinds a community, when justice is devoured by fire. But while Salem burned, another family, the Vanderbilts, built fortunes so vast they believed no curse could touch them. They were wrong. Picture this: New York City, 1800s. Smoke rising from steamships, the metallic clang of railroads, and the glitter of high society balls. At the center of it all stood the Vanderbilts, a family so wealthy, so powerful, that newspapers called them the American royalty. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built an empire of ships and railroads, stacking mountains of gold so high that his children were born into palaces instead of homes. Their fortune became their curse. At first, the Vanderbilts seemed untouchable. They built mansions the size of castles. Imagine chandeliers dripping with diamonds, marble staircases that seemed to stretch into heaven, and dinners where champagne flowed like rivers. Yet behind the glitter was something darker: greed, arrogance, and a shadow that would swallow their dynasty whole. By the early 1900s, just 2 generations after the Commodore's death, the Vanderbilts had blown through nearly the entire fortune. Billions in today's money gone. Not by war, not by disaster, but by extravagance. Imagine throwing $1 million costume party while the poor starved in the streets. That was the Vanderbilt way. Their downfall wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. Their endless quest for status destroyed them from the inside. Family feuds erupted like wildfires. Brothers suing brothers, cousins poisoning reputations. What good is gold when it buys nothing but betrayal? Would you rather be born with everything and lose it all, or be born with nothing and fight your way to the top? By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt mansion stood as hollow ghosts. Vast ballrooms filled with silence, gardens left to rot, marble staircases crumbling under dust. The once great dynasty of American royalty had become a cautionary tale, proof that money can't outlast time. Today, none of the Vanderbilts rank among America's richest families. Their empire, once worth more than $200 billion in today's dollars, evaporated like smoke. The fortune that was supposed to last forever vanished in just 3 generations. But here, the haunting part. Some say the Vanderbilts weren't just victims of greed. They were cursed. Stories whisper of family members plagued by sudden deaths, addictions, and madness, as if the empire was built not just on steel and steam, but on broken souls. And while the Vanderbilts watched their fortune sink into shadows, another dynasty, the Astors, sailed straight into tragedy on the most cursed ship in history, the Titanic. Close your eyes and imagine this. The year is 1912, the Atlantic Ocean stretches endless and black beneath a starlit sky. On that water glides a ship so massive, so luxurious it was called unsinkable, the Titanic. And aboard it was one of the richest men in America, John Jacob Astor IV. He wasn't just any passenger. He was the crown jewel of the Astor dynasty, a family whose name dripped with wealth and power. But by the end of that icy night, the Astor name would be forever tied to tragedy. John Jacob Astor boarded with his young, pregnant wife, Madeline. At 47, he was old enough to be her father. She was only 18. Their scandalous marriage had already shocked New York high society. But that marriage, and the Titanic, became the stage for one of the darkest family stories in American history. When the iceberg struck, chaos ripped through the ship. Screams, shattering glass, the groaning sound of metal tearing like paper. Imagine standing there, hearing the icy water rushing in, feeling the deck tilt beneath your feet. And in that chaos, Astor made his choice. He placed his wife in a lifeboat, kissed her goodbye, and stepped back into the freezing night. He tried to board with her, pleading that his wife was pregnant, but the crew pushed him back. Women and children first. Those words sealed his fate. Hours later, his body was pulled from the sea. His face crushed, his clothes torn, his pockets filled with thousands in cash. The richest man on the Titanic, drowned with strangers. What would you do with all the money in the world if you couldn't buy one more breath of air? The Astor family never recovered from the shadow of that night. Madeline gave birth to his son, John Jacob Astor VI, who grew up knowing his father died in icy darkness. The boy became known as the Titanic baby. Imagine living with that title, your very existence a reminder of catastrophe. But the Titanic was only one of the Astor tragedies. Over generations, the family was plagued by scandals, divorces, feuds, overdoses, even mysterious deaths. Their golden name became tarnished, their fortune shattered by greed and misfortune. By the late 20th century, the once great Astors, who had owned hotels, mansions, and entire blocks of New York, were no longer America's elite. Like the Vanderbilts, their empire sank. The Titanic was just the beginning of their curse. But if the Astors' tragedy was written in icy waters, the Romanovs' fate was written in blood, beneath the guns of revolution. It was a warm July night in 1918, and the Romanov family, Russia's last imperial dynasty, was huddled together in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and their young son Alexei. The family believed they were being moved to safety. Instead, they were moments away from one of the most brutal executions in history. The Romanovs had ruled for more than 300 years. They were untouchable, divine in the eyes of their people. But by the early 20th century, their empire was crumbling. Poverty, war, and revolution turned the people against them. Yet Nicholas clung to power, blind to the storm building outside his gilded palace. Alexandra, the Tsarina, trusted a man most hated in Russia, Rasputin, a mystic, healer, and scandalous figure whose influence over the family was seen as proof of corruption. Some whispered that Rasputin himself cursed the Romanovs before his own violent murder. And then came the final blow, the Russian Revolution. Soldiers once sworn to protect the throne now dragged the family like prisoners across the country. They were stripped of crowns, of titles, of dignity. Picture the basement that night, dim lamps flickering, the smell of damp stone, the Romanovs clutching one another in confusion. Suddenly, armed men burst in. The family was told to stand for a photograph, but instead of a camera, rifles were raised. The shots echoed, screams filled the room, smoke choked the air. Bullets bounced off jewels sewn into the daughters' dresses, forcing executioners to finish the job with bayonets. Imagine being born into unimaginable wealth, only to die nameless, buried in a pit, erased from history. The Romanovs' bodies were dumped in shallow graves, doused with acid, their dynasty wiped out in a single night. Or so the world thought. For decades, rumors spread that one of the daughters, Anastasia, survived. Imposters across Europe claimed to be her, sparking legends and conspiracies. Was it hope or a curse that refused to die? The truth came almost a century later. In the 1990s and 2000s, DNA testing confirmed the Romanovs were indeed all executed. But the legend of Anastasia endures, proof that the family's ghost still haunts Russia's memory. Their fall wasn't just a royal tragedy. It was the death of an empire, the blood-soaked birth of Soviet Russia. A reminder that no throne, no crown, no dynasty is safe from the fire of revolution. But while the Romanovs were slaughtered by bullets, the Borgias destroyed themselves, with poison, lust, and power. Rome, late 1400s. The Vatican's golden halls shimmered with candlelight, echoing with the chants of holy men. But beneath the incense and marble floors lurked a family so feared, so infamous, that their very name became a warning: the Borgias. The patriarch Rodrigo Borgia seized the papal throne as Pope Alexander VI, the Holy Father of the Catholic Church. Yet behind closed doors, he fathered children, drowned in wealth, and turned Rome into a stage for sin. His family rose alongside him, his ruthless son Caesar, his cunning daughter Lucrezia, and their dynasty of secrets. The Borgias didn't rise through faith, they rose through poison. Whispers spread that at their dinner parties, goblets of wine weren't blessings, they were weapons. Guests who threatened their power fell suddenly ill, their last breath staining the tablecloths red. The family's tool of choice, a deadly brew known as cantarella. Smooth, tasteless, impossible to detect, and always served with a smile. Cesare Borgia wasn't just a nobleman, he was a warlord. He crushed enemies, seduced allies, and left entire regions trembling. Machiavelli himself modeled the prince after Caesar's cold ambition. Imagine being so ruthless that you became the blueprint for tyranny. Lucrezia, often painted as a pawn, may have been far more dangerous than history admits. Some say she carried a hollowed-out ring filled with poison, ready to tip into any rival's drink. Was she a victim of her family's schemes, or a queen of death in her own right? What would you do if power itself became your family's curse? How far would you go to hold on to it? But poison is a double-edged blade, and soon the Borgias found themselves choking on their own venom. Allies turned into enemies, rivals circled like wolves, and scandals erupted faster than they could silence them. Rome streets hissed with rumors of incest, corruption, and blood sacrifices. Even within their dynasty, betrayal brewed. Caesar's ambition consumed him, dragging the family into endless wars. Rodrigo, the Pope himself, died suddenly, some whisper poisoned by his own cup. The Borgias, once untouchable, crumbled from the inside out. Today, their name lives on not as saints or saviors, but as a symbol of power corrupted. They remind us that dynasties built on deceit and death never last. The Borgias weren't destroyed by enemies. They were destroyed by themselves. But if the Borgias were devoured by poison, the Tudors were consumed by secrets, buried deep beneath the English crown. The year was 1485. The battlefield at Bosworth was soaked in blood, the clash of steel echoing across England. From that carnage rose a new dynasty, the Tudors, and at its heart was a man who would become both legend and tyrant, Henry VIII. The Tudors are remembered for their crowns, castles, and power, but beneath the velvet and gold, their story was dripping with betrayal, secrets, and death. A family cursed not by fate, but by their own ruthless ambition. Henry VIII married 6 wives, but only one gave him the son he craved. To get what he wanted, he rewrote religion itself, tearing England from the Catholic Church. Imagine being so obsessed with power and bloodlines that you'd split an entire nation in two. The palace walls hid unspeakable horrors. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, was executed after being accused of adultery and witchcraft, charges many historians believe were fabricated. Her ghost, they say, still haunts the Tower of London, carrying her severed head in her hands. Henry's daughter, Mary I, tried to restore Catholicism through fire, earning the name Bloody Mary. Hundreds were burned alive at the stake, the smell of charred flesh haunting England's skies. Her half-sister Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, brought stability, but never escaped the shadow of paranoia, betrayal, and plots against her life. What's more terrifying, an enemy outside the crown or a curse festering inside your own bloodline? The Tudors wore jewels, but they also wore fear. Every whisper in the halls of Hampton Court could mean treason. Every feast could be poisoned. Every smile could hide a dagger. Even in death, their secrets were buried with them. Henry VIII's coffin reportedly burst open years later, his bloated body leaking onto the church floor. Dogs were said to lick his blood. Whether myth or truth, it became a chilling symbol. The king who devoured everything was finally devoured himself. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth I, leaving no heir. After decades of war, executions, and shifting faiths, the great Tudor line vanished. A family that ruled through terror and secrecy, erased by the very obsession that built their power, legacy. But the Tudors' ghosts never truly left. Their castles remain, their portraits stare coldly through time, their name whispered in stories of betrayal and blood. The crown they carried was more than gold, it was a curse. But if the Tudors' curse was sewn into their crown, the Medicis carried their curse in their veins: sin, gold, and the blood of Florence. Florence, 15th century. The smell of ink from freshly printed books filled the air, the clang of coins echoed in crowded markets, and the glow of candlelit chapels reflected the rebirth of art and knowledge, the Renaissance. And at the heart of it all was one family, the Medicis. They weren't kings or emperors, they were bankers, but with their gold they bought crowns, popes, and artists, shaping the destiny of Europe. Their name became synonymous with wealth, power, and sin. Cosimo de' Medici built an empire not with swords, but with loans. Kings and popes owed him fortunes, and with every debt collected, the Medici family tightened their grip on Europe like invisible puppeteers. Their influence reached beyond politics. They funded geniuses: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli. The Sistine Chapel, Florence's domes, some of the greatest masterpieces of human history exist because of Medici gold. But here's the irony. The family who bankrolled divine beauty was drowning in corruption, greed, and bloodshed. Behind their palaces, whispers grew louder: poisonings, assassinations, forbidden affairs. Brothers turned against brothers, cousins plotted in secret. One of the most infamous events, the Pazzi conspiracy, erupted in 1478 when rivals tried to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici inside a cathedral. Imagine holy chants turning into screams, marble floors splattered with blood, daggers flashing beneath stained glass windows. How far would you go to protect a dynasty built on both gold and sin? The Medicis wore velvet, but their hearts were armored in suspicion. Every banquet could end in betrayal. Every chalice of wine could hide poison. The beauty of Florence was their legacy, but it was paid for with shadows. The family's reach even extended to the Vatican. 4 Medici popes ruled the church. But instead of holiness, they brought scandal, selling indulgences, fueling corruption, and igniting the fire of Martin Luther's Reformation. The very gold that built churches also shattered faith across Europe. As centuries passed, the Medici dynasty rotted from within. Extravagance, inbreeding, and constant intrigue drained their strength. By the 1700s, the once great line was gone, leaving behind art, palaces, and a warning: gold buys beauty, but it also buys damnation. The Medicis built the Renaissance, but they also built their curse. Their name survives in history not as saints, but as sinners cloaked in marble and glory. But while the Medicis wielded gold, the Habsburgs wielded blood, royal blood cursed by inbreeding and madness. In the chilling winter of 1692, Salem Village became the stage for one of the darkest chapters in American history, the infamous Salem witch trials. At the very center of this hysteria stood the Putnam family, a clan whose influence, ambition, and thirst for power turned neighbors against each other and sent innocent people to the gallows. It all began when young girls in Salem claimed they were bewitched, convulsing and screaming in supposed torment. While panic spread like wildfire, one family fanned the flames more than any other: the Putnams. Led by Thomas Putnam and his wife Anne, the family seized the hysteria as an opportunity to expand their power and settle old grudges. Their daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., became one of the most vocal accusers, pointing her trembling finger at dozens of supposed witches. But here, where it gets sinister, many of the people accused happened to own land the Putnams coveted. In Puritan Salem, land was everything, a symbol of wealth and legacy. By accusing rivals of witchcraft, the Putnams ensured trials would destroy them, freeing up valuable property that conveniently fell into their reach. What looked like religious zeal was, in reality, a calculated family strategy cloaked in piety. The results were catastrophic. 19 men and women were executed, crushed, or hanged, while many others rotted in prison. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families shattered, and Salem's reputation was forever stained. While hysteria consumed the town, the Putnams' influence grew stronger. Even when the trials ended, whispers lingered. Had this been true religious terror, or a family's cold-blooded land grab masked as righteousness? But fate carries its own justice. Years later, Anne Putnam Jr., the same girl whose accusations doomed so many, publicly confessed that her words were lies. She admitted to being misled, possibly manipulated by her own family's ambitions. Her apology came too late. Scores of lives had already been destroyed. The story of the Putnam family serves as a haunting reminder of how fear, greed, and manipulation can twist entire communities into madness. What makes this chapter so terrifying isn't just the hangings or the hysteria. It's the fact that one powerful family could orchestrate mass paranoia for their own gain, leaving behind a legacy soaked in guilt and blood. Even today, when we speak of Salem, we remember not just the witches who never were, but the family who ensured they would burn. What if the witch trials weren't just hysteria, but one family's ruthless plan for power? Few families in history wielded as much power or carried as much darkness as the Habsburgs. For centuries, this dynasty ruled vast empires across Europe, controlling Spain, Austria, and even parts of the New World. But behind their glittering crowns and golden palaces lay a sinister truth. The Habsburgs were a family built on obsession, manipulation, and a dangerous bloodline curse. The Habsburgs believed so deeply in preserving their power that they turned to one of the most destructive practices in history, inbreeding. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and over generations, the dynasty began to collapse from within. The most famous result of this obsession was Charles II of Spain, often called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Charles was born with severe deformities, including the infamous Habsburg jaw, a grotesquely extended chin that made eating and speaking difficult. But his problems went far beyond appearance. He was plagued by seizures, infertility, and mental decline. Rumors spread that he was cursed, the product of witchcraft. In reality, Charles was the tragic face of centuries of genetic self-destruction. While Charles struggled to rule, powerful Habsburg relatives pulled the strings, manipulating him like a puppet to advance their own ambitions. Entire wars were waged, not for religion or freedom, but for dynastic control, as rival families circled like vultures over the weakening empire. But here, the chilling twist, the Habsburgs' downfall wasn't brought by outside enemies. It was caused by their own obsession with keeping power pure. By refusing to mix bloodlines, they created a dynasty that literally consumed itself. When Charles II died childless in 1700, the once mighty Spanish Habsburg line ended in tragedy, sparking the bloody War of Spanish Succession. And yet, their shadow didn't vanish. Even today, history remembers the Habsburgs not only for their golden age of conquest, but also for the haunting image of a family cursed by their own greed. Their portraits, still hanging in European palaces, reveal the chilling faces of rulers whose power came at the ultimate cost, the destruction of their own bloodline. The Habsburg story isn't just about kings and empires. It's about what happens when ambition turns inward, when a family's hunger for power blinds them to reason, science, and even nature itself. It is a warning that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of its own darkness. What destroyed the mighty Habsburg Empire? Enemies on the battlefield, or a curse written in their own blood? Imagine being trapped in the wilderness, surrounded by towering mountains and endless snow, with nothing left to eat but each other. That's the nightmare that became reality for the Donner family and their fellow pioneers in the winter of 1846–47. Their journey west was supposed to be a bold step toward a better future. Instead, it became one of America's most infamous survival tragedies, a story of hunger, madness, and cannibalism. The Donners set out with hope in their hearts, part of a larger wagon train bound for California. But impatience sealed their fate. Urged by reckless guides, they took a so-called shortcut through the Sierra Nevada. The path was treacherous, filled with jagged cliffs, choking dust, and hostile terrain. Every mile drained their supplies and their spirits. Then came winter. A brutal early snowstorm buried the mountains under nearly 20 feet of snow. The Donner Party was trapped. Wagons broke. Oxen starved. Families huddled together in makeshift shelters, the icy winds cutting through them like knives. Food dwindled to nothing. Leather shoes, bark, even boiled animal hides became desperate meals. But when the last scraps of survival were gone, whispers turned into horror. Cannibalism. Men, women, and children faced a decision no human should ever face: starve to death or eat the dead. Some resisted, clinging to morality even as their bodies wasted away. Others gave in, consuming the flesh of friends and family just to survive one more freezing night. The Donners themselves became symbols of this nightmare. Their camp was described as a frozen graveyard, half-buried bodies, silence broken only by the groans of the dying, and the smell of death lingering in the air. Rescue parties that finally reached them months later recoiled at the sight. Survivors stumbled out of the snow, eyes hollow, skin stretched over bone, haunted forever by what they had done. Here's the chilling twist. The Donner tragedy wasn't just about bad luck. It was fueled by arrogance, greed, and betrayal. Leaders ignored warnings. Guides lied about shortcuts. And when the storm hit, no one came quickly enough to save them. The American dream of conquest and expansion had a hidden cost, and the Donners paid it in blood. Today, the word Donner is forever etched into American history as a symbol of desperation. But beyond the horror of cannibalism, their story forces us to ask, what would you do if survival demanded unthinkable choices? Would you die with dignity, or sacrifice everything just to see another sunrise? When the food ran out, the real nightmare began. But the darkest hunger wasn't for bread, it was for human flesh. In the quiet Massachusetts town of Salem, 1692, whispers turned into screams, and neighbors became executioners. The Salem witch trials weren't just about hysteria. They tore entire families apart, leaving a stain on America's past that still chills us today. It began with strange fits among young girls, convulsions, screams in the night, bodies writhing as if possessed. The community, steeped in fear and superstition, didn't see illness. They saw the devil. Panic spread like wildfire, and suddenly, witchcraft was blamed for every crop failure, every stillbirth, every misfortune. Families who once shared meals now accused each other of consorting with Satan. The Putnams pointed fingers at the Porters. The nurses, once respected, became villains in whispered stories. Husbands betrayed wives, children testified against parents. The court became a stage where lies carried more weight than truth, and every accusation added fuel to the fire. By the time the trials reached their fever pitch, over 200 people were accused and 20 were executed, 19 by hanging, one by being crushed to death under heavy stones. But the true horror wasn't just the deaths. It was the destruction of families, generations. Of names were tarnished, reputations shattered, bloodlines marked forever with the shame of witchcraft. The Nurse family offers one of the most tragic examples. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother known for her piety, was accused and executed despite her innocence. Her children watched helplessly as their mother was dragged to the gallows. Her name, once respected, became a curse whispered in the streets. The same fate struck others, mothers, fathers, daughters, families broken by fear and hysteria. But here, the haunting twist. Salem's witch hunts weren't just random paranoia. They were fueled by old grudges, land disputes, and power struggles. Families used the trials to eliminate rivals, to seize property, to settle scores under the guise of justice. The devil may not have walked in Salem, but human greed and vengeance certainly did. Even after the trials ended, the survivors carried scars no apology could erase. Children grew up without parents. Families lived under suspicion. The town itself became a graveyard of guilt, where the echoes of prayers and screams still seemed to linger in the air. Today, Salem is remembered as a warning of what happens when fear overpowers reason, when communities turn on their own. The fire of witchcraft didn't just burn individuals, it scorched entire family legacies into ash. And here's the question that lingers like smoke. If fear struck your town, if survival meant pointing a finger at your neighbor, your friend, your family, would you stay silent, or would you betray them to save yourself? In Salem, the devil wasn't in the woods. It was in the hearts of neighbors who turned against each other. In the 19th century, one name commanded awe, envy, and fear in America: Vanderbilt. They were the kings of railroads, the masters of steamships, the family that built an empire of unimaginable wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, turned grit and ruthless ambition into a fortune so vast it made him one of the richest men in history. His descendants inherited castles, jewels, and a name that promised eternal power. But behind the glittering mansions and lavish parties, the Vanderbilt family was spiraling into a curse of its own making, a curse of greed, waste, and downfall. The Commodore built his empire with iron fists and cold calculation, crushing rivals and expanding his reach. He left behind a fortune estimated at more than $200 billion in today's money. Yet within just a few generations, the Vanderbilt wealth would be squandered, leaving nothing but shadows of grandeur. The second generation lived in excess. Cornelius's heirs constructed mansions so massive they seemed more like palaces than homes. Newport's Marble House, Biltmore in North Carolina, and the Gilded Age castles of Fifth Avenue. But instead of securing their empire, the Vanderbilts drowned in extravagance. Parties with rivers of champagne, gold-plated carriages, and ballrooms glittering with diamonds became their new obsession. Here's the chilling twist. While the Vanderbilts flaunted their riches, the world around them changed. The railroads that once fueled their empire lost dominance to oil, steel, and electricity. Their money, once endless, was divided and divided again through generations. What had seemed eternal began to crumble. By the 20th century, the Vanderbilt name was still famous, but their fortune was vanishing. By 1973, not a single Vanderbilt was listed among America's richest. The palaces stood empty, sold off, or abandoned. The family that once symbolized unstoppable power now symbolized the fleeting nature of wealth itself. But perhaps the darkest shadow wasn't just the money lost. It was the legacy wasted. The Commodore's ruthless drive gave his descendants a fortune, but without his vision, they lived only for decadence. Their story became a warning. Even the greatest dynasties can collapse when wealth replaces wisdom and luxury consumes purpose. Today, tourists walk through the ruins of Vanderbilt mansions, staring at ballrooms once filled with laughter and glittering gowns. The silence in those halls whispers the truth. No fortune, no matter how vast, can protect a family from its own destruction. So we ask, if you inherited unimaginable wealth, would you build an empire, or waste it all chasing pleasures that disappear like smoke? The Vanderbilts thought their fortune would last forever, but within a century, it was gone. At the dawn of the 20th century, few names carried as much power and prestige as the Astors. They were America's aristocracy, heirs to fortunes built on fur trading, real estate, and ruthless ambition. Their lavish hotels and mansions stood as monuments to wealth. To be in a store was to be untouchable, or so it seemed. But beneath the glitter of chandeliers and ballroom dances lay a legacy steeped in tragedy. The Astor dynasty began with John Jacob Astor, a man who clawed his way from obscurity to become America's first multimillionaire. He built his fortune with fur pelts, opium smuggling, and New York real estate. His descendants inherited not just money, but a hunger for power and influence. By the late 1800s, the Astors were America's closest version of royalty. But here's the twist. Money couldn't shield them from fate. In 1912, the world watched in horror as the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, struck an iceberg and plunged into the Atlantic. Among its passengers was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men alive. He had boarded the Titanic with his much younger new wife, Madeline, who was pregnant with their first child. When the icy waters rose, Astor did what so many wealthy men believed they never would. He faced death head-on. He put Madeline on a lifeboat, kissed her goodbye, and promised he'd join her soon. But when he asked to board with her, he was denied. The rules were strict: women and children first. Hours later, his body was pulled from the freezing sea, battered and unrecognizable except for the gold watch still ticking in his pocket. That single moment turned the Astors from symbols of invincibility into a family forever tied to tragedy. Madeline survived, giving birth to Astor's son, but his legacy became overshadowed by the Titanic's ghostly story of arrogance and loss. And the darkness didn't end there. Generations of Astors struggled with scandal, addiction, and bitter family feuds. Their fortune fractured. Their influence faded. The dynasty that once defined New York high society became a shadow of itself, remembered less for power and more for its tragedies. Walking past the grand Astor mansions today, you see empty relics of a family that seemed untouchable until the ocean swallowed its brightest star. Their story isn't just about wealth. It's about the cruel truth that no fortune, no matter how vast, can outwit fate. So here's the chilling question. If you had all the wealth in the world, would you feel safe? Or would you always fear the iceberg waiting just beneath the surface? The Titanic didn't just sink a ship, it sank the Astor dynasty's illusion of immortality. Picture this: the endless Kansas prairie, the wind hissing through tall grass, the horizon stretching into eternity. Travelers rode this lonely road in the 1870s, seeking rest at a small inn run by a family of German immigrants. It looked harmless enough: beds, food, warm smiles. But stepping inside meant walking into the jaws of death. This was the home of the Bender family, America's first known serial killer clan. The Benders were four: John S.R., Pa, Elvira, Ma, John J.R., and Kate. They lived in a one-room cabin divided by a canvas curtain. On one side they welcomed weary guests, offering hot meals and a place to sleep. On the other side was the slaughterhouse. Their method was simple, brutal, and efficient. Travelers were seated at a table with their backs to the curtain. As they ate, one Bender distracted them while another swung a hammer to the skull. The body was dragged through a trapdoor, throat slit, valuables stolen. The prairie swallowed the victims, shallow graves dug in the orchard nearby. Here's the bone-chilling twist: the Benders didn't just kill for money, they seemed to revel in it. Kate Bender, young and striking, lured men in with flirtations, offering spiritual healing and seances. She promised lonely travelers connection, only to deliver death. Witnesses later described her eyes as cold, unblinking, like she knew something they didn't. For years, people vanished along that lonely road. Families disappeared. Men never reached their destinations. But the prairie was vast and suspicion slow. The Benders operated with terrifying confidence. Locals even broke bread at their table, never realizing they were sitting inches away from blood-soaked boards. The truth came out only when neighbors grew suspicious of missing travelers. A search revealed the horror: bodies buried face down in the orchard, skulls crushed, throats slit. One victim was found with his child beside him, both slaughtered without mercy. And then, when authorities moved to arrest the Benders, the family was gone. They had fled, vanishing into the frontier night. Despite nationwide manhunts, rewards, and rumors, the Benders were never captured. Some claimed they were lynched in secret. Others swore they lived under new names. Their fate remains a chilling mystery. The Benders' story isn't just America's first family of serial killers. It's a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the ordinary. An inn by the roadside, a smile at the table, a family that promised comfort while sharpening the blade. So ask yourself, would you have seen through their charm, or would you have been just another body beneath the orchard soil? The Benders' cabin looked like shelter, but it was a slaughterhouse in disguise. When the bodies were unearthed from the Bender orchard, the entire frontier reeled in horror. Families gathered in silence, staring at the shallow graves, at the crushed skulls and slashed throats of neighbors, travelers, even children. The truth was undeniable. The Bender cabin wasn't an inn, it was a death trap. But just as the world demanded justice, the Benders pulled off one final chilling trick. They vanished. By the time lawmen arrived, the Bender house was eerily empty. The table was set, chairs pushed neatly in, food rotting in bowls. The curtain still hung, hiding the blood-stained boards beneath. But the killers? Gone. Horses missing, wagons taken, the prairie carrying only faint tracks that led into endless wilderness. The search parties found signs the family didn't leave together. The wagon tracks split, some heading north, others west. Had they scattered to survive? Or did neighbors help them escape, preferring vigilante justice over courts? Rumors swirled. Some claimed the Benders were lynched in secret, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. Others swore sightings popped up across states: Kate in Texas, John J.R. in New Mexico, Ma and Pa hiding under new names in the frontier. Every town seemed to have a story. A mysterious woman in a brothel who spoke German and matched Kate's description. A farmer with a scar who could have been John J.R. A rumor of Pa shot dead in Colorado, but nothing was ever proven. The family that turned murder into routine simply melted into the landscape of America's Wild West. This vanishing act fueled the legend. Newspapers spread lurid tales, Kate practicing witchcraft, John Jr., laughing over corpses, Ma screaming curses as she fled. Rewards were posted, but no bounty hunter ever collected. The Benders became ghosts, real killers transformed into folklore, haunting the frontier long after their cabin rotted into the earth. Survivors of the victims never found peace. Children grew up knowing their fathers, brothers, or husbands had been butchered and dumped like garbage. Every whisper of a Bender sighting reopened the wound. The prairie itself became cursed ground, a place locals avoided after dark. Some swore they heard cries on the wind, the restless souls of travelers calling out from the orchard graves. And here's the darkest truth. To this day, no one knows the final fate of the Bloody Benders. Were they killed? Did they live among ordinary people, their hands still stained with blood? Or are they still out there, their story buried under new names and new disguises? The Benders' escape wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, proof that sometimes evil doesn't die, it simply disappears. So the question is, would you rather know the Benders were punished, or does it terrify you more that they might have walked free, blending into history? The Bender killers vanished without a trace. Were they buried in secret or standing in plain sight? The Bloody Benders may seem like an isolated nightmare, just one family of killers on the Kansas prairie. But when you step back, their story looks eerily familiar. Across history, powerful families, royal, political, or infamous, have all been stalked by curses, betrayals, and blood-soaked legacies. What if the Benders weren't just killers, but part of a larger pattern that stretches through time? Think of the Romanovs. They ruled Russia with crowns of gold, but their dynasty ended in a cellar, gunned down, their blood soaking the walls. Or the Kennedys, America's shining dynasty, torn apart by assassinations, plane crashes, and scandal after scandal. Then there are the Habsburgs, who thought they could control fate by controlling their bloodlines, until madness and deformity consumed their empire from within. Now ask yourself, how different were the Benders? They may not have worn crowns or built empires, but their family legacy was just as cursed. A household bound together by lies, secrecy, and ritual bloodshed. Pa's cold brutality, Ma's shrieking superstition, John Jr.'s manic laughter, and Kate's seductive cruelty. It wasn't just murder, it was a dynasty of death. Just like the Borgias used poison at their tables, the Benders used the dinner table as their weapon. Food, wine, a smile, then death. Both families turned hospitality into homicide. The difference? The Borgias' legacy stained palaces in Rome. The Benders left their curse on the American frontier. The Benders' disappearance mirrors the vanishing of dynasties like the Tudors. One moment they're powerful, feared, untouchable. The next, they're gone, leaving only mystery and rumor. History hates loose ends, yet both the Tudors and the Benders left behind shadows that still haunt us centuries later. So why do these family curses echo across time? Maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it's the truth that no family, no matter how rich or poor, can escape the weight of its own sins. Some destroy themselves through greed, others through obsession, and some, like the Benders, through blood spilled in the dark. The chilling question remains: did the Benders choose evil, or were they part of a curse that stretched far beyond Kansas? Were they ordinary killers, or proof that some families are destined to be consumed by their own darkness? Because here's the reality. Whether it's a crown, a fortune, or a roadside inn, when a family feeds itself on power, greed, or blood, the end is always the same: tragedy. The Benders weren't just killers. They were part of history's endless cycle of cursed families. If the Bloody Benders showed us how a family could turn a farmhouse into a slaughterhouse, then the Romanovs remind us that even palaces are not safe from curses. Their story begins with crowns of gold and ends with gunfire in a dark cellar. But in between, it's a tale of power, superstition, and a dynasty doomed from the start. For over 300 years, the Romanovs ruled Russia like gods on earth. They commanded armies, built cathedrals, and crushed rebellions. Yet beneath the surface of their glittering empire, shadows were always gathering. Tsar after tsar fell victim to betrayal, assassination, or madness. Ivan the Terrible slaughtered his own son in a fit of rage. Peter the Great tortured his heir until the boy died in chains. And Nicholas II, the last Romanov, would see his children lined up against a wall, awaiting the sound of gunfire. The Romanovs believed in mystics, prophets, and healers, and this superstition may have sealed their fate. When Tsarevich Alexei was born with hemophilia, a disease that made a simple bruise life-threatening, the family turned to Rasputin, the mad monk. To some, he was a healer. To others, a demon in human form. His influence over the Tsarina Alexandra created scandal, distrust, and whispers of corruption that rotted the empire from within. Nicholas II wasn't just overthrown by revolution. His downfall was marked by eerie coincidences. The same year he abdicated the throne, the Bender's crimes were rediscovered in Kansas newspapers. Different continents, same omen. Families built on fragile power eventually collapse under their own weight. Then came the night of July 17, 1918. The Romanovs, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and loyal servants were herded into a basement in Yekaterinburg. They were told it was for their safety, but in seconds rifles and pistols erupted. Bullets ricocheted off jewels sewn into the daughters' dresses. The air filled with smoke, screams, and chaos. When it was over, the dynasty of the Romanovs lay in heaps, their blood staining the cellar floor. And here's the haunting part. For decades, no one knew where their bodies lay. Rumors swirled that Anastasia had escaped, that Alexei lived in hiding, that the Romanov line would return. The same whispers that followed the Benders, survival, escape, unfinished curses, followed the Romanovs too. So what connects a cursed peasant family in Kansas to a royal dynasty in Russia? The answer is chilling. Blood is a chain. Whether in a farmhouse or a palace, when families are built on power, lies, and desperation, fate has only one ending: a dark cellar, a shallow grave, or the silence of disappearance. The Romanovs died in a cellar, but their curse never stayed buried. If the Romanovs were Europe's fallen royals, then the Kennedys became America's version, a dynasty of power, wealth, and glamour, haunted by an unshakable curse. Theirs is not just a political story. It's a blood-stained timeline where assassinations, plane crashes, and scandals stalk every generation. And it all begins with one man, Joseph Kennedy, Sr. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch, built his fortune in ruthless ways: rumors of bootlegging during Prohibition, backroom deals, and political bargains. He dreamed of building not just wealth but a dynasty that would rival kings. Dynasties demand sacrifice, and the Kennedys' sacrifices came drenched in tragedy. The curse struck almost immediately. Joseph's eldest son, Joe Jr., was groomed for the presidency. But in 1944, during World War II, his plane exploded in midair over England, scattering his remains across the sky. He was the first heir to fall. Then came Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, Joseph's glamorous daughter. In 1948, just 4 years later, she died in a plane crash in France. That made 2 children lost before the family even rose to its peak. But the curse wasn't finished. The world watched as John F. Kennedy, the shining star, the youngest U.S. president, was gunned down in Dallas in 1963. Just 5 years later, his brother Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles while running for president. 2 brothers, murdered on live television. The Kennedys weren't just losing, they were unraveling in front of the entire world. Even outside politics, the curse reached them. In 1969, Ted Kennedy's car drove off a bridge, drowning young campaign worker Mary Jo Kopchen. His political career never recovered. In 1984, Robert's son, David Kennedy, died of a drug overdose. In 1997, Michael Kennedy died in a skiing accident. And in 1999, The world was stunned again when John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, killing him, his wife, and her sister. It seemed that no matter how much wealth, influence, or ambition they had, the Kennedys could not escape death's grip. And here's the chilling connection. Like the Benders, like the Romanovs, the Kennedys show us that power always demands blood. Farmhouse killers, royal assassins, and political bullets, they are all threads in the same cursed tapestry. Families that rise too high too fast seem destined to pay in the most violent ways imaginable. The Kennedy curse isn't just history, it's an unfinished story. Because even today, new generations of Kennedys step into politics, into the spotlight, into fate's cruel game. The question is if the curse will strike again. It's when. The Kennedys built a dynasty in America, but fate built them a coffin. Power is dangerous, but in the Tudor dynasty, power was lethal. Behind the glittering crown of England's most infamous family lay betrayal, blood, and secrets so dark they reshaped a nation forever. It all begins with Henry VII, a king whose obsession with control and heirs turned him into one of history's most feared rulers. The Tudors rose to power in 1485 after Henry VII defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, ending the Wars of the Roses. But peace didn't last long. The dynasty's survival hinged on producing a male heir, and Henry VII would go to terrifying lengths to secure one. Henry's desperation for sons led him to discard wives like pawns. 6 marriages, 2 divorces, 2 executions. One died in childbirth. One outlived him. But the chilling reality, every wife became part of a curse, a tragic pattern where loyalty meant death. Anne Boleyn, the most famous of them all, promised Henry sons but delivered only Elizabeth. She was accused of witchcraft, incest, and adultery, a web of lies spun by Henry's court to justify her beheading. Her ghost is said to still wander the Tower of London, headless, searching for justice. His son, Edward VI, inherited the crown as a boy but died at just 15. Mary I, known as Bloody Mary, reigned next, burning Protestants alive in her desperate bid to restore Catholicism. Her rule ended in sickness and despair. And finally came Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who ruled with brilliance but never married, ensuring the Tudor bloodline would die with her. But beneath the royal drama lay an even darker truth. The Tudors weren't just cursed by love and death, they were cursed by paranoia. Brothers turned on sisters, cousins plotted assassinations, and rivals met the executioner's axe. The Tower of London ran red with Tudor blood, the smell of smoke and iron haunting every corner. By 1603, with Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty vanished into history, leaving behind only ghosts, severed heads, and whispers of betrayal. Their rise had been dazzling, but their fall was inevitable, proof that no crown, no matter how golden, can shield a family from doom. And here's the chilling connection. Just like the Kennedys, just like the Romanovs, the Tudors show us that dynasties are built not on love but on sacrifice. In the Tudors' case, that sacrifice was always blood. The Tudors ruled with crowns of gold, but wore shadows of death. Florence, Italy, the Renaissance capital of art, beauty, and invention. But behind Michelangelo's masterpieces and the glittering domes of cathedrals lurked a family whose wealth and power came at a deadly cost: the Medici. They weren't just bankers, they were kingmakers, poisoners, and puppet masters of Europe. The Medici began as merchants, but their banks grew to control the wealth of kings and popes. By the 15th century, they weren't just counting coins, they were shaping history. They funded artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli, giving birth to the Renaissance itself. That gold was cursed. For every painting they commissioned, blood spilled in secret. Cosimo de' Medici, the family's patriarch, ruled Florence from the shadows, pulling strings like a puppet master. His fortune bought influence, but it also bred jealousy. Rivals whispered of corruption, greed, and pagan magic hiding beneath his Christian mask. When Cosimo died, the family seemed untouchable, but power never sleeps. Enter Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Charismatic, brilliant, and ruthless, Lorenzo ruled like a king without a crown. But in 1478, during Easter Mass, assassins struck in what became known as the Pazzi conspiracy. Priests chanting, incense burning, and suddenly, knives slashing at Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano inside Florence's Grand Cathedral. Giuliano was butchered on the church floor, stabbed 19 times as worshippers screamed. Blood on marble. Holy hymns drowned in horror. Lorenzo survived, but the message was clear. The Medici throne was bought in blood. The Medici poisonings. Rumors swirled that Catherine de' Medici, who later became Queen of France, kept a cabinet of poisons disguised as perfumes and jewels. Enemies drank from jeweled goblets and never woke again. She was accused of orchestrating the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris. Whether myth or truth, the Medici name became forever linked with murder hidden beneath luxury. And yet, for all their sins, the Medici couldn't outrun fate. Their dynasty fractured, splintered by greed, betrayals, and scandals. By the 18th century, their line ended in weakness and decay, their once mighty empire reduced to whispers of what had been. The family that gave the world art also gave it terror. The Medici story is proof of a chilling truth. Power isn't earned, it's taken. And what's taken in blood always demands blood in return. The Medici gave us the Renaissance, but also the blueprint for sin. Europe's grandest throne, castles stretching from Spain to Austria. The Habsburg dynasty ruled half the known world for centuries. But behind the jewels, behind the marble halls, lay a curse etched not in superstition, but in blood itself. The Habsburgs were undone by their own bloodline. It began with ambition. To keep power within the family, the Habsburgs married their cousins, uncles, even nieces, generation after generation. The belief was simple: protect the crown at all costs. Instead of protecting them, this practice poisoned them. Genetic diseases crept silently through the bloodline until royalty itself began to crumble. The most infamous case, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, his jaw jutted grotesquely forward, a deformity so severe it's still called the Habsburg jaw. His tongue was so swollen he struggled to speak, his body so weak he couldn't eat without choking. Charles could barely walk, barely think, barely rule, and yet he was the king of Spain. Behind palace walls, courtiers whispered that he was bewitched, cursed by demons. But science tells us the truth. Centuries of inbreeding had destroyed him. Charles was infertile. Despite 2 marriages, he produced no heir. And with his death in 1700, the great Spanish branch of the Habsburgs collapsed, plunging Europe into the bloody war of Spanish succession. The very empire they'd fought to preserve through incest was ripped apart in war. But the curse stretched beyond Charles. The Habsburgs were stalked by madness, stillbirths, and strange illnesses. Emperors slid into paranoia. Queens wasted away. And through it all, the family clung desperately to tradition, unwilling to break free from the marriages that were killing them. Their castles became mausoleums. In Vienna's imperial crypt, row upon row of ornate sarcophagi contain the bodies of Habsburgs lost to their curse. Some tombs hold tiny coffins, children who never lived past a few days, infants born broken, victims of their own blood. Step inside, and the air is heavy with the weight of centuries, the smell of stone and death. The irony: the Habsburgs were obsessed with control, control of crowns, control of borders, control of destiny. But what they couldn't control was themselves. Their dynasty didn't fall because of enemies. It fell because their blood turned against them. The Habsburgs remind us of a chilling truth. Sometimes the greatest monsters are not assassins, conspirators, or curses from the outside. Sometimes the curse lives within the family itself. The Habsburgs ruled the world, but their blood destroyed their throne. The year was 1846. A group of pioneers set out from Illinois, chasing the American dream of new land in California. Among them was the Donner family, patriarch George Donner, his wife Tamsin, and their children. They believed they were headed toward promise, freedom, and fortune. But what awaited them in the Sierra Nevada mountains was a nightmare written in ice and blood. At first, the journey was ordinary. Wagon wheels creaked across endless plains. The smell of campfires filled the night. Children laughed under wide western skis. But then came the fateful decision to take the so-called Hastings Cutoff, a shortcut that promised to shave weeks off their trip. It wasn't a shortcut at all. The trail was longer, steeper, and deadly. By the time the Donner Party reached the Sierra Nevada, winter had already descended. Snow fell, then more, then more. The wagons sank into white prisons. Horses collapsed. Food ran out. By November, the Donners and over 80 settlers were trapped in the mountains, cut off from the world by walls of snow as high as cabins. The smell of rot began to creep into the icy air as starvation set in. Families turned on each other. Some clung to faith, praying for deliverance. Others whispered of the unthinkable cannibalism. And then it happened. Bodies frozen in the snow became meals. Flesh was stripped from the dead to keep the living alive. The Donners, along with others, were reduced to animals in the wilderness. George Donner's hand became infected after a simple cut, leaving him weak and dying. His wife, Tamsin, had the chance to escape with rescuers, but refused to abandon him. She stayed behind, choosing love over survival. Her body was never found. Rumors whispered that she, too, had been eaten. Only 48 out of the 87 pioneers survived. Half the Donner family was gone. Children orphaned. Parents devoured. Survivors stumbled out of the mountains in rags, their eyes hollow, their souls broken. California, once a land of dreams, became the backdrop for one of the most horrific tragedies in American history. Even today, the Donner Pass remains a cursed place. Travelers still feel the weight of that winter, as if the mountains themselves remember. Snow falls, silence reigns, and ghosts whisper in the trees. The Donner family story isn't just about hunger. It's about how fragile civilization really is. Strip away comfort, warmth, and food, and even the most hopeful families can descend into horror. The Donners set out to chase fortune. Instead, they carved their names into America's darkest legend. The Donners dreamed of California, but found only cannibalism and death. Once upon a time in America, there was a family so rich, so powerful, that their name was synonymous with gold. The Vanderbilts, built by Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, rose from humble beginnings to dominate railroads, shipping, and Wall Street. Their wealth was so vast it rivaled kings. But here, the haunting twist. Within just a few generations, their empire collapsed, their fortune squandered, their mansions left to rot like ghosts of a gilded past. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing. A tough, ruthless man, he ferried goods across New York Harbor before clawing his way into railroads and steamships. By the time he died in 1877, he had amassed $105 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, making him one of the richest men in American history. His dynasty should have been unbreakable. But here, where the curse began, money built on ruthlessness rarely survives kindness. His heirs inherited not just fortune but excess. The Vanderbilts built castles across America, opulent mansions like the Breakers in Newport and the Biltmore in North Carolina. Their halls dripped with gold, chandeliers sparkled like constellations, and every party was a carnival of wealth. Guests dined on caviar beneath ceilings painted like heaven itself, but behind the glamour lurked rot. They spent faster than they earned, pouring millions into luxury and reputation, while the empire that built their fortune weakened. By the early 20th century, the family's railroads crumbled under competition and mismanagement. The stock market shifted. America moved on. But the Vanderbilts didn't notice, too distracted by parties, marriages, and scandals. Within 3 generations, the once mighty Vanderbilt fortune was gone. By 1973, when the family gathered for a reunion, not a single Vanderbilt was a millionaire anymore. Imagine that. One of the richest families in history reduced to shadows of their former selves. Their mansions became their tombstones. The Breakers still stands, but only as a museum. The Biltmore, once a private palace, is now a tourist attraction. Empty halls echo with footsteps of strangers, not heirs. The chandeliers still glimmer, but not for Vanderbilts, only for visitors paying admission. The family that once ruled America now survives as a cautionary tale. The Vanderbilts prove a chilling truth. Wealth alone cannot preserve a legacy. Power fades, gold rots, mansions crumble, and sometimes the greatest curse of all isn't poverty, it's the memory of having had everything and losing it. The Vanderbilts dreamed of eternity. Instead, they became a ghost story dressed in velvet. The Vanderbilts built America's castles. Now they stand as empty tombs. In the glittering Gilded Age of America, one family stood taller than the rest, the Astors. They were the landlords of New York, the masters of fortune, the embodiment of elegance and excess. Their name adorned hotels, mansions, and entire city blocks. But here, the chilling twist. Behind the glamour, the Astors' story is one of betrayal, death at sea, and a dynasty shattered by greed. The Astor Empire began with John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant who clawed his way to unimaginable wealth through fur trading and Manhattan real estate. By the mid-1800s, the Astors were America's aristocracy, living in marble palaces along Fifth Avenue, their wealth so vast they were called the landlords of New York. But money never comes without shadows. Family feuds. The Astors were notorious for backstabbing each other over inheritances. Generations of cousins and brothers waged wars in courtrooms, clawing at the fortune like vultures. Even their grand mansions became symbols of rivalry, each trying to outshine the other in luxury and size. The Titanic. In 1912, John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, boarded the doomed ship with his young, pregnant wife, Madeline. When the iceberg struck, chaos erupted, screams, icy water rushing in, lifeboats lowering into the dark Atlantic. Astor tried to board with his wife but was denied. Witnesses say he kissed her hand, stepped back, and vanished into the night. Hours later, his body was pulled from the sea, crushed and frozen, his fortune unable to save him. His unborn child survived, but the dynasty was forever scarred. Decline. The Astors' vast wealth began to splinter as heirs spent lavishly, fought bitterly, and sold off properties that once defined New York itself. By the late 20th century, the Astor Empire had withered. Their iconic hotels were sold, their mansions demolished, their name reduced to a ghost in the history books. And when socialite Brooke Astor, the last grand dame of the family, died in 2007, her own son was convicted of exploiting her for money. The dynasty that once symbolized wealth ended in scandal and courtroom shame. Step into what remains of the Astor legacy today and you won't find royalty. You'll find empty buildings, faded portraits, and tragic echoes. The Astors show us that wealth is not a shield, not from betrayal, not from scandal, not from death in the freezing Atlantic. They had everything, they lost everything, and their name, once spoken with awe, now whispers like a ghost through the streets they once owned. The Astors ruled New York until the ocean swallowed their king. Long before the Kennedys, the Astors, or the Vanderbilts, there was another family dynasty in America, one built not on wealth or legacy, but on blood. They were the Benders of Kansas, and their story is darker, more horrifying than any cursed royal line. Because while other families were destroyed by fate, the Benders chose their curse, murder. It was the early 1870s. The frontier was wild, lawless, and full of travelers chasing fortune in the West. Along the Osage Trail in Labette County, Kansas, stood a small wooden inn run by a quiet family of German immigrants, John Bender, his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and daughter Kate. To weary travelers, the Bender Inn seemed a place of rest, a warm meal, a bed, and friendly conversation by firelight. But here's the twist. For many, it became their grave. The setup was diabolical. Guests would be invited to dine at the inn, seated at a place of honor near a canvas curtain. As they ate, distracted, one of the benders would creep behind the curtain, hammer in hand. A single crushing blow to the skull. The body would be dropped through a trapdoor, throat slit, then buried in the orchard. Kate Bender, the daughter, posed as a psychic and healer. She lured victims with her beauty and promises of spiritual guidance. Men followed her entranced. They never returned. Families traveling west disappeared into silence. Dozens were slaughtered, their belongings stolen, their names erased, until suspicion began to grow. In 1873, after a doctor searching for missing neighbors vanished near the Bender property, locals rode out to the inn. What they found was straight from a nightmare. The Benders were gone, vanished without a trace. But in the orchard, the earth gave way to shallow graves. The stench of death filled the air. Bodies upon bodies unearthed, skulls caved in, throats cut. Men, women, children, all victims of America's first known serial killer family. The Benders were never caught. Despite nationwide manhunts, rumors of lynchings, and countless sightings, the family disappeared into legend. Some claimed they escaped to Texas. Others believed vigilantes hunted them down and buried them in unmarked graves. The truth, we'll never know. What makes the Benders so chilling is not just their murders but their ordinariness. They looked like a family. They acted like a family. But behind the curtain of their inn was death itself. Unlike the Kennedys or the Habsburgs, who were destroyed by fate, the Benders created their own curse and unleashed it on anyone unlucky enough to cross their threshold. Even today, their abandoned land in Kansas is whispered to be haunted. Travelers report strange sounds, shadows in the orchard, and an uneasy feeling, as if the ground itself remembers. The Benders remind us that sometimes the darkest dynasties aren't born of crowns or riches, but of bloodlust. The Benders didn't just lose their legacy, they buried it beneath their orchard. When you look at America's darkest family stories side by side, a chilling pattern emerges. The Kennedys, haunted by fate and tragedy. The Hatfields and McCoys, consumed by blood feuds. The Habsburgs, crushed by inbreeding and dynastic collapse. And then the Benders. Unlike the others, they weren't cursed by destiny or genetics. They weren't victims of politics, war, or disease. No, the Benders chose their curse. They built it with hammer blows, with knives, with a hunger for death. And here lies the terrifying truth. Some family curses come from forces beyond their control, but others, they are carved into history by human hands. Think about it. The Kennedys lost presidents and heirs to assassinations and accidents. The Hatfields and McCoys shed blood over generations, locked in a cycle of revenge. But the Benders turned their home into a slaughterhouse. They murdered together, a family united not by love or loyalty, but by the thrill of the kill. This was no accident, no feud, no tragic twist of fate. This was evil as a family tradition. And maybe that's why the Benders haunt us more than any dynasty, because they prove a horrifying possibility. Sometimes, blood curses aren't inherited, they're created. The deeper twist: the Benders vanished into the shadows, never facing justice. Their crimes left scars not just on Kansas, but on the entire American imagination. Even today, the ground they once tilled carries whispers of their deeds. It's as though the land itself remembers the blood soaked into its roots. Farmers and travelers alike claim strange noises in the orchard where the bodies were found. Some speak of figures at the edge of the field, watching, waiting. This isn't just folklore, it's a reminder. Families can rise and fall, but when their names are bound to death, they never truly vanish. The Hatfields live on in legend. The Kennedys remain icons of power and loss. And the Benders, they remain phantoms, shadows that history can't bury. While other cursed families lost everything, the Benders escaped. Their legacy isn't broken, it's unfinished. Somewhere their bloodline may still exist. Somewhere, descendants of America's first serial killer family may be alive, walking among us, carrying that same dark legacy in their veins. So ask yourself this: what's more terrifying? A family destroyed by fate, or a family that disappeared into the night with their curse still roaming free? The Kennedys had tragedy, the Hatfields had vengeance, but the Benders, they had murder. And they might still be out there. Some stories fade with time, but others, like a curse, only grow stronger. The Romanovs were wiped out in a basement, their bloodline erased. The Borgias poisoned their way into history, leaving behind whispers of betrayal. The Kennedys carried tragedy in their veins, with fate hunting them generation after generation. And the Benders, they didn't just live their curse, they perfected it. Each of these families tells us one terrifying truth. Bloodlines are fragile, but legacies of darkness are eternal. Look closely and you'll see a pattern. The Medici draped Florence in gold, but behind the marble palaces lurked assassination and scandal. The Tudors buried their secrets with crowns and swords. The Habsburgs built empires, only to be undone by their own blood. And then, on the lonely Kansas plains, the Benders set up an inn and transformed it into a trapdoor to hell. Wait, think about that. Across centuries, across continents, royal families and dynasties collapsed under curses of fate, greed, and blood. But the Benders, they weren't kings or queens. They weren't nobles. They were farmers, ordinary people, who became extraordinary monsters. That's the twist that still chills us. You don't need a crown to create a dynasty of fear. Imagine walking into that inn. The smell of stew simmering, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the faint smile from Kate Bender. Then silence, a hammer to the skull, a throat cut clean, the trapdoor creaking open, and underneath a shallow grave, no royal conspiracy, no palace intrigue, just death delivered in the simplest, coldest way possible. That's why the Benders sit at the darkest corner of this family tapestry. The Romanovs, the Tudors, the Medici, they were cursed by power. But the Benders, they cursed themselves. They carved their legacy into the soil of Kansas with blood, bone, and terror. And here's the part no one wants to admit. Maybe every family has shadows. Some hide them behind money, others behind crowns. The Benders, they lived in the open plains where no one could hear the screams. But they remind us of something terrifying, that curses don't always come from the heavens or fate. Sometimes they're made in the choices we make and passed down like heirlooms. So when you hear the names of cursed dynasties, the Borgias, the Tudors, the Kennedys, don't forget the Benders. Because while the others are buried in palaces, castles, and cemeteries, the Benders disappeared. Their curse didn't end. It slipped into the night, waiting to be found again. Because the scariest thing about a curse isn't when it ends. It's when you realize it might still be out there. Kings fell to fate, dynasties to greed, but the Benders, they chose their curse, and they might have passed it on. Picture this, a long table stretching across centuries. At its head sit the Romanovs, their royal blood staining the snow of Ekaterinburg. Next to them, the Borgias raise poisoned goblets, smiling through betrayal. The Tudors, draped in velvet and steel, whisper secrets buried with crowns. The Medici count their gold with trembling hands, shadows of assassins at their door. The Habsburgs clutch their fragile lineage, cursed by their own blood. The Kennedys stare into the cameras, only for bullets and tragedy to strike them down. The Donner Party, gaunt and broken, feast in silence on the only thing left, each other. The Salem families burn with the smoke of witch trials. The Vanderbilts and Astors drown in fortunes that vanish like ghosts. And at the far end of the table, the Benders sit quietly. No crowns, no riches, just a hammer, a knife, and a trapdoor. They don't speak. They don't need to, because they represent something darker than power, greed, or fate. They represent choice. Wait, what if that's the final twist? What if curses don't just happen? What if they're chosen, inherited, invited into bloodlines through greed, betrayal, or hunger? The Romanovs didn't see the end coming until the bullets. The Borgias thought power made them untouchable, even as poison rotted their legacy. The Tudors tried to bury their secrets, but the ground never keeps quiet. The Medici believed gold could silence sin, but it only bought shadows. And the Benders, they built their curse one body at a time, hammer blow by hammer blow, until history couldn't forget their name. Listen closely and you'll hear the repetition. blood, betrayal, hunger, greed, over and over across families and centuries. It's as if these dynasties are bound by the same thread, a thread of darkness twisting through time, never breaking, only changing form. And here's the part that will keep you awake tonight. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. History repeats because we repeat it. Families rise, families fall, and some families, like the Benders, choose to drag the world down with them. So ask yourself this. If every cursed family sits at the same table, where do we sit? Are we the audience, watching their downfall like entertainment? Or are we heirs to the same curses, ready to repeat their mistakes? Because here's the chilling truth, curses don't die, they evolve. And tonight when you lock your doors and turn off the lights, remember this, the Benders were never caught. Their bloodline might still be out there, and curses never stay buried. Crowns can shatter, fortunes can fade, but the Benders prove one truth. Sometimes the darkest curse is survival. The story of the Benders and the cursed families we've walked through. The Romanovs, the Borgias, the Tudors, the Medici, the Habsburgs, the Kennedys, the Donners, the Salem victims, the Vanderbilts, the Astors. They all leave us with one chilling question. Do curses ever end? The Romanovs' blood stained the floor of a basement. The Kennedys lost sons, brothers, and presidents to tragedy after tragedy. The Tudors wore crowns heavy with secrets and betrayal. And the Benders, they simply vanished. No execution, no justice, no final chapter, just whispers, rumors, shadows moving on the horizon. That's the darkest ending of all. Because when a curse ends in fire or blood, at least it feels closed. But when it disappears, it lingers, it festers, it grows. Imagine this. Somewhere in America, a descendant of the Benders could be alive. Maybe they don't know their ancestry, or maybe they do, and they're keeping the family legacy hidden, waiting. The thought alone is enough to send shivers down the spine, because evil doesn't always announce itself with crowns or wealth. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in a neighbor, in a stranger, in a smile across a dinner table. And that's why the Benders' story remains the most terrifying of all. Not because of the murders, they were brutal, yes, but because of the silence afterward, the unanswered questions, the empty graves, the possibility that the curse still walks among us. Listen, you can almost hear it, the creak of the trapdoor, the faint echo of screams buried under Kansas soil, the whispers of dynasties long gone, tangled together in a single truth. Families can rise, families can fall, but when they are marked by blood and darkness, they never truly leave. So when you hear the names, the Romanovs, the Borgias, the Kennedys, the Tudors, the Medici, the Habsburgs, remember this, their curses are history, but the Benders, their curse is unfinished. It's out there, breathing, waiting for its next chapter. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one to stumble into it. Because the scariest monsters are not the ones buried in graves. They're the ones that vanish into the night and never come back. The Romanovs were erased, the Kennedys were broken, but the Benders disappeared, and curses don't vanish, they wait.